So this is part 4 of a 6-part series of 1 plus 1 equals 2. In part 1, I was just discussing the general concepts of single things existing out there. There's no actual platonic form, as they say, but it's a concept that we agree on as sentient beings. And then when you put them together, it forms a construct of two. Maths, things like that, those are constructs which are the combination of several different concepts into one. Then part 2, I discussed when you have sentient beings, beings that are self-defining, and how they can relate together in this relatively simple and uncontroversial statement. In part 3, I discussed the concept or the idea of ownership, or how does that come to be when you're talking about inanimate beings and sentient beings acting on those. So now in part 4, we're going to get to a situation where we're going to bring back the inanimate beings and try to put together parts 1, 2, and 3 into making more of a case of what you might think that I'm trying to apply this situation to. There's several things that are happening in society, and I think problems occur due to how we define X rather than what X actually is. And if we actually get into a situation where we can understand what we're talking about on the basic aspect, we'll be able to understand each other better. I think you can personally think of situations where you were talking about the topic, but somebody didn't really seem to understand what you meant by it. Then when you actually took the time to set the actual definition of it and the parameters, then you'd come to some understanding. Or you'd at least be able to say, even if you don't agree with what they're saying, you will both be able to understand where your disagreements come, and it's a lot more amicable of a situation. So as we had in the first part, you have person X here, you can call person Y here. Those two people come together and they can make a couple. You would say, okay, this is a couple of people. This is now two people. One person, they make two people together, but they have their own individual bodies. They have their own individual identities. They have their own individual responsibilities, own individual expectations that you'd expect them to actually have in just dealing with each other and the things that they utilize. Just as we mentioned here, if somebody decides to come and use their pencil, let's say Y was using their pencil and they were using it to draw on X's paper, then you would say, okay, Y drew on X's paper. It's something that Y did to that paper. And then you can say, okay, Y adjusted or changed the nature of X's paper in that sense. But it would still be X's paper even though it's Y's mark. I think that's a rather straightforward thing to say. Now, there are also situations where you can say, okay, these two people have come together and they've made certain agreements. Depending on how this Y came to be on X's paper, you can say, okay, now you can hold Y and X responsible for the results of that. X can't just go and write X on the paper and say, oh, Y did that. Y is an artist, so Y is responsible for it. No, there would be a situation where there would have to be an agreement to say that, okay, if X and Y come together and want to create a drawing, X provides the paper, Y provides the ability and the art, then you can say, okay, this at that point, with that agreement from both these people, would have some kind of shared ownership of this. But it's still at the whole time X's paper, and it's still at the whole time Y's ability on that paper. I think that's rather straightforward. Now, let's get to something that is not quite as straightforward, and this is when we start getting the confusion. I think if you've been following this series, if you've been following this channel, following my content, you kind of know where I've been going on some of these topics. So here you have one cell, one sex cell. As I mentioned with the paper, these are stationary. You can say, okay, paper is different from pencil. I agree, paper is different from pencil. They're two separate things. But you can say these are both pieces that you need to create a drawing. These are both pieces of stationery. In that kind, you can say maybe they're the same sort of thing, but exactly not the same thing. But then them coming together, as we mentioned here, when you bring the paper and the pencil, does that create a new entity here, or is that the combination of the two things? In this sense, you can't really combine two individual humans into one yet. I mean, maybe when you get like teleporters and things like that, you might be able to combine people together. But this is the only process that is similar to the combination where something new is created at the end. So you have one sex cell there, you have another sex cell here, let's just call them the sex cell Y and sex cell X, and then when you have those two coming together, although I agree X and Y in the genetic sense does not necessarily dictate the appearance of the individuals, this isn't a current year type of thing. I had the intention to use X and Y flipped over here, and that's going to transition a bit later on. You create this sex cell. Well, should have tested this pen before. Now you create this new entity and you have the cell division going on here. This is what happens when conception happens. As I mentioned, these things can get a bit more complicated or convoluted as you're talking about just adding two things to one. So just trying to make sense of this. Bear with me as I go. I think I'll find a way to get this simpler after I've done this entire series, but just want to get this out first. So depending on the nature of the two things that are added together, it's going to affect if you call that addition of two individual things into one. This is the simple nature of life, humanity, existence is single sex cells coming together in this way that we reproduce to create a new entity, a new cell. And in that process, these two cells are destroyed. When you have a situation when you have a pencil, as I mentioned before, some part of the carbon, part of the carbon comes off, just like little parts of the letters come off as I speak. But my voice is still here, myself is still here. The pencil is still here to a certain extent as you keep drawing. On the piece of paper, marks are put on it. The paper still remains. There's no actual destructive process. The state of being a pencil with that tiny bit of carbon is reduced when you actually draw on the piece of paper, and the state of being a blank sheet of paper is changed, but you can sort of return to that. As I mentioned, you can erase the effect of y. You can erase the effect of y on x's paper here. But when you come to this situation, when you're creating a new entity, there is nothing you can erase. I mean, you can find a sort of eraser, as I mentioned in this part as well, that could damage the actual piece of paper in the erasure process. So if you wanted to erase that, you could remove this from being visually on the paper with like a pen eraser. Remember when they used to have those Stedler things? I think it was Stedler. It was like one side was a reddish kind of thing, and one side was blue, and you could erase down, but that would take out more. So there is that process in there to be understood. So to finish off with this last entity, considering this process that creates a new entity in that situation, what do you have here? When you have x plus y coming together, choosing to have intercourse, and share their x plus y cells that meet together and create this, what is the end situation that you have here? What is the result? Is it just two people like that? Or do you have a situation where this is the equation where you come to, okay, now we're talking about, do things start getting more complicated or are things rather straightforward? What would the equation be here? Would now this equation of the two people coming together, this is in there, these are x and this is y. Now, would this equation be a family, a single unit? Or is this three people? Is this 1 plus 1 equals 3 when you put this in together? Because people say, oh yeah, we're pregnant. When somebody says we're pregnant, what do they mean we're pregnant in that sense? I know some people don't really like that and they say, oh no, it's a woman who's pregnant. But if it's a family, let's say they've already gotten to the situation, X and Y came together on a piece of paper, they made a contract to say, together, us two individuals will be held together and through sickness and through health and make decisions together, share our bank accounts, share certain responsibilities and things like that, and come together, and then they decide to engage in intercourse, which is the process of reproducing a human being, and they come to this situation. In that point, what is your actual definition of this? 1 plus 1 equals what in that situation? So for now, that's the end of this part. You can see it's getting a bit more convoluted, a bit more complicated. I'll get better at trying to make some more sense out of this. As you see, we started just from the simple 1 plus 1 equals 2, 2 negative 1 equals 1. Seems to be uncontroversial, seems to be straightforward, but we can see through this process that things can become relatively more convoluted, relatively more complicated, depending on certain situations. But I think if we have conversations where we're all understanding the X that is being spoken of, you can have a better situation. Because if you're thinking you're just talking about inanimate beings, that's another thing. If you're thinking you're just talking about human beings, that's another thing. So you have to define the concept and you can understand the actual agreement, the actual construct that is being discussed in any given situation.